Genesis 19:24. Let's read. Then the Lord, yhwh, or Jehovah, or yhwh, then Jehovah rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah, right? From Jehovah, from the Lord out of heaven. Literal translation of the Hebrew. Then Jehovah rained brimstone fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from Jehovah out of heaven. So Jehovah brings fire and brimstone to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah from Jehovah out of heaven. So this Jehovah is in heaven. But there is someone else called Jehovah, and he's not in heaven, he's on earth. So Jehovah on earth brings fire and brimstone from Jehovah who's in heaven. Okay, let's see what Carlos does with this. He says this is a Hebrew idiom, a way that Bible writers or speakers would refer to someone or to themselves, right? And he gave 3 examples. He mentions 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 1, right? 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 12 to 13. So write these down. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 1. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 12 to 13. And 1 Samuel chapter 25, verses 21, 22. So let's see what these passages say and what Carlos's point was, and do they refute the fact that in Genesis 19:24, you have 2 distinct persons identified as Jehovah, a Jehovah on earth and a Jehovah in heaven. Let's see. Okay, 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 1. Pay attention to the language. Now Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief fathers of the children of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem. Oh, does that mean there are 2 Solomons? It says Solomon assembled Israelites to King Solomon. Solomon assembled Israelites to King Solomon. So there are 2 Solomons? Or is this simply a Hebrew idiomatic way of saying that Solomon gathered people to himself? No one would assume there are 2 Solomons. Literally, the Hebrew says Solomon gathered certain Israelites to King Solomon. No one would assume there are 2 Solomons, a Solomon that gathers and another Solomon whom they're gathered to. This is simply a Hebrew way of saying Solomon gathered people to himself. Okay, now let's look at the other examples. Let's look at 1 Samuel 20, 12 to 13. Jonathan speaks of himself in the 3rd person. 1 Samuel 20, 12 to 13. Then Jonathan said to David, the Lord God, Jehovah Elohim of Israel, is witness. When I have sounded out of my father sometime tomorrow, or the 3rd day, and indeed there is good toward David, and I do not send to you and tell you, may Jehovah the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. But wait, Jonathan speaking. May Jehovah do so and much more to Jonathan, meaning I. So he refers to himself as I and Jonathan in the 3rd person. No one would assume that here there are 2 Jonathans, right? But if it pleases my father to do you evil, then I will report it to you and send you away, that you may go in safety, and Jehovah be with you as he has been with my father. Okay, that's the 2nd example. Okay, now let's look at the 3rd example that he referenced, and now let's embarrass this fraud. 1 Samuel 25, 21 and 22. 1 Samuel 25, 21 and 22. David speaks of himself in the 3rd person. Now David had said, surely in vain I have protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belongs to him. He's talking about Nabal, fool. And he's repaid me evil for good. May God do so, and more also to the enemies of David. Wait, but this is David speaking. So why is David saying, may God do so, and more so also to the enemies of David? Why not to my enemies? If I leave one male of all who belong to him by morning light. So David refers to David in the 3rd person, even though he's speaking of himself. Jonathan refers to Jonathan in the 3rd person, even though he's referring to himself. And 1 Kings 8:1, the inspired author, says Solomon gathered certain Israelites to King Solomon, even though he's referring to the one self-same Solomon. No one would assume there are 2 Solomons, 2 Jonathans, 2 Davids. You see his point? Do you see what he's trying to get at? Do you see his point? So now you're stumped, Trinitarians. Justin Martyr is stumped. Tertullian is stumped. Irenaeus is stumped. All these theological, spiritual giants have been stumped and refuted by these heretics. Even Martin Luther quoted Genesis 19:24 to show that Jesus is the Jehovah on earth, bringing fire and brimstone from Jehovah who's in heaven. They've stumped us. Now, you ready for the decimation? Okay, let me tell you why this is a false analogy. Okay, but you got to read carefully. According to Genesis 18, verses 1 to 3, specifically 1 and 2. Then the Lord Jehovah, yhwh, appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. Notice verse 2. So he, Abraham, lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men. Coincidence? 3 men. So they're appearing in human form, in human shape, so that if you don't know any better, you think they're actual human beings. 3 men were standing by him, and when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground and said, My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Now, as you continue reading the narrative all the way to 14, it says, Abraham brought water for their feet to be washed. So notice these men have bodies, human shape that are so real and tangible that when you touch their bodies, it feels solid, physical. It's like you're touching an actual flesh body. And they have feet that can actually be washed by water. And on top of that, they are fed food, right? Abraham cooks food and they eat human food. Food that's of the earth, food made by humans, in these human bodies that they've assumed. Even though they didn't become actual flesh, they didn't become actual human beings, they didn't actually take to themselves the nature of humanity. They simply appeared temporarily in human form, in human shape, but that shape was so real, so tangible, that you could touch it and feel it physically, and in those shapes, perform human activities such as eat food. Yep, milk and meat, right? Fatted calf. Okay, now, who was one of the 3? Now, let's read Genesis 18, 20 to 26. So there is no doubt that at least one of them, if not all 3 of them, is Jehovah God appearing as a man with a human shape, a human body that's so real and tangible that you touch it, it's physical, solid. And in that human shape, human body, Jehovah can eat food like other human beings and have tangible feet that can be washed and touched. Even though he didn't become flesh, even though he didn't become human, even though he didn't take to himself a second nature, that of humanity. That only took place one time in history, where the eternal word condescended to enter the womb of the Blessed Virgin and be conceived in her womb as a human being, not a human person. One eternal divine person who took on human nature, truly became human, was born as a human, a male baby, and went through all the human developmental stages. Let's continue. Genesis 18, 20, 26. Notice, Jehovah said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, this is where you got to pay attention. This is where this heretic is exposed, because he already knows these passages. I will go down now, because he's up in Jerusalem and Canaan, right? Canaan, not Jerusalem. So I'm going to go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me. And if not, I will know. So I'm going to go down there personally and investigate the matter, so that the things said about them, I will personally verify whether they're true or not. So now what happens? Watch here, verse 22. Then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom. But Abraham still stood before Jehovah. The text is plain as day. At least one of the men was on earth, And Abraham stood before him face to face. You can't get around it. And Abraham came near. Abraham came near and said, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Now notice who this man standing before Abraham is said to be. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Wow. Abraham had no doubt that at least one of them, if not all three of them, at least one of them, if not all three of them, was Jehovah, his God, appearing as a man, the one who judges the earth in righteousness. That Genesis 18:25. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Okay. Verse 26. So Jehovah said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Now, at the conclusion of this conversation where Abraham intercedes for the righteous to be spared, here's what we read in verse 33. Here's what we read in verse 33. Okay, watch here. So the Lord Jehovah went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. There is no escaping the fact this is taking place on earth at a specific location, at a specific spot. Can't get around it. But it says Jehovah went his way. Well, where's Jehovah going? Well, let's read 21, same chapter. Where is Jehovah going next? I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. So you cannot escape. Jehovah is going down to Sodom. Okay. So question, according to this passage, let's take the majority position. One of the three men, not all three, one of the three men is actually Jehovah. Jehovah has appeared as a man with a human body at a specific location in the earth. Jehovah eats human food, and Jehovah converses with Abraham face to face in human bodily shape. Can't get around it, right? So he's on earth. Everyone got that? Now, he's not going to return to heaven, but he's now going to appear at another location in the earth, Sodom. That's what he says. I will go down to Sodom. Okay. Now let's read Genesis 19:24. Now let's read Genesis 19:24. And I'm going to read all the way to 29 in a minute, because I want you to pay attention to Genesis 19:24 and verse 27 when I get there. So Job is on earth. Then the Lord Jehovah rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from Jehovah out of the heavens. How is this parallel to 1 Kings 8:1 or 1 Samuel 20:12-13 and 25:21-22, where here you have a Jehovah on earth and a Jehovah in heaven? You have one Jehovah in heaven and another Jehovah on earth. How in the world is this parallel to these passages that Carlos Xavier brought up? How is this an example of a Hebrew idiom where when you read carefully, you're clearly told of one Jehovah on earth and another Jehovah in heaven? How's that parallel to Solomon gathering people to King Solomon, or Jonathan speaking of himself in the third person, or David speaking of himself in the third person? In those cases, we know there's only one person who's Solomon, one person who's Jonathan, one person who's David. But here we're told Jehovah is on earth as a man, and fire comes from this Jehovah in heaven. A Jehovah in heaven, a Jehovah on earth. Now, to further prove that this Jehovah's on earth and there's a Jehovah in heaven, let's continue reading. Genesis 19:24-29. Note verse 27. Now I'm going to start at 25. So he overthrew those cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. Now watch. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Now notice verse 27, guys. And then I'm going to give you some other points that will further blow your mind away. Verse 27. And Abraham went early in the morning. Abraham went early in the morning, verse 27, to the place. Now, Abraham's not in heaven. So this place is on earth, where he had stood before Jehovah. Boom! What more proof do you want? This Jehovah is on earth that Abraham spoke with, and there's another Jehovah who's in heaven. Okay? Verses 28, 29, let's finish it. Then he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land, which went up like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt. Do you see how wickedly dishonest Carlos Xavier is? How are these passages parallel to Genesis 19 and Genesis 18? How are these texts, Solomon gathering Israelites to King Solomon, Jonathan referring to himself in the third person, David referring to himself in the third person, parallel to Genesis 18, 19, where we're already told clearly, explicitly, black and white, you have Jehovah on earth in human shape, appearing as a man, performing human activities, and a Jehovah in heaven from which the fire and brimstone came forth, came down upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Everyone got it? So that argument got decimated, but there's a few more salient points. Okay, now here's where you're going to get blown away. In these examples I'm going to give you, it's not God speaking in the third person. What do I mean third person? In the Bible, you'll find individuals and writers speaking of themselves in the third person. For example, I would say, let me tell you something. Do not get Sam Shamoun angry, because if Sam Shamoun gets angry, it's over for you. Well, I'm Sam Shamoun. So why am I speaking of myself in the third person? That's third person usage. And it is true that throughout the Bible, our Lord Jesus, the most perfect example, and others speak of themselves in the third person. For example, Jesus praying. John 17:3 says, this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. So Jesus just spoke of himself as Jesus Christ in the third person. Now, with that said, let me show you examples where God refers to another who is God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. Are you ready? In light of what I just showed you, these cannot be examples of God speaking in the third person. Cannot be, if you pay attention. Why? Okay, here. Let's start with Amos chapter 4, verse 11. Amos chapter 4, verse 11. God is talking about what he did to some of the Israelites because of their persistent idolatry, immorality, and bloodshed. I overthrew some of you, Amos 4:11, as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. God is speaking. I, God, overthrew some of you as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. And you were like a firebrand plucked from the burning, yet you have not returned to me, says Jehovah. Oh, wow. Instead of saying in Amos 4:11, I overthrew some of you as I overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, instead God says, I overthrew some of you as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, how do we know this is not God speaking of himself in the third person? How do we know? Because in Genesis 18:19, there you see a Jehovah on earth as a man and a Jehovah in heaven. One Jehovah destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah by the other who's Jehovah. So this is how we know here God is not speaking of himself in the third person. He's actually referring to someone else who is Jehovah Almighty, one with him. You got it? Because there are two more examples where God again speaks of Sodom and Gomorrah as being destroyed by someone else who is God. Two more examples where God again mentions Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed by someone else who is God. Jeremiah 50, verse 40. As God overthrew, he doesn't say I, as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighbors, says Jehovah. So why didn't Jehovah say, as I overthrew? No, but Jehovah speaking says, as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighbors, says Jehovah, so no one shall reside there, nor son of man dwell in it. He's likening the destruction of the Babylonians to what God did to Sodom and Gomorrah. Why didn't he simply say, as I overthrew? Here's the other one. Isaiah 13, 17 to 19. Isaiah 13, 17 to 19. This one, pay attention who's speaking. Behold, this is talking about God destroying the Babylonians again for their wicked evil. Behold, I will stir up the Medes. I will raise up the Medes, this people, to destroy Babylon. I will stir up the Medes against them, who will not regard silver. And as for gold, they will not delight in it. And also their bows will dash the young men to pieces. What it's saying is, when I stir up the Medes to carry out the evil intents of their hearts, even gold and silver will not cause them to shrink back from destroying the Babylonians. In other words, if the Babylonians try to pay them enormous, exorbitant amounts of money, they still would wipe them out because they don't care about money. They care about destroying the Babylonians, and I will unleash them on the Babylonians. Remove my constraint and let them act upon their wicked hearts. And their bows will dash the young men to pieces, and they will have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not spare children. Now, who's speaking? I will stir up. So it's God speaking. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, and the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Here's a third time where God is speaking of someone else who's God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. Why in these three places doesn't God simply say, as I destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah? And is God speaking of himself in the third person? So when he says God overthrew, he's simply referring to himself in the third person. No, it cannot be third person use. Why? Because we've already seen and proven and shown in Genesis 18 and 19, there's a Jehovah on earth appearing as a man who brought fire and brimstone from someone else called Jehovah in heaven. So one Jehovah employed the other one who's Jehovah to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. So this cannot be third person usage or Hebrew idiom.